last day. I'm very glad that the class is as big as it is now. I was thinking, oh, maybe 3 people will show up. And one of them will be me and the other will be Dr. Gertheis. So thank you for coming back. And I'm glad you did, because this is going to be the culmination and summary and reflection session. We're going to cover a lot of new things, but it's going to all be in response to the big so what question. Why did we go through this book at all? Why did we talk about any of this? So, another thing I want you to know that I'm going to do today is I'm going to assume the Christian worldview, because for those of you who went through the world religions class with us, the case for Christianity being the only legitimate, true, and trustworthy hope that we have is something that I'm going to assume, because I truly believe that Buddhism does not give you ultimate hope in the face of death, because the goal is extinguishment, not anything like what you see in Revelation 21 and 22. The goal of Hinduism, at least what you're probably familiar with in Hinduism, is that you become one with everything. It is monism. It's oneness, ultimate oneness. So you lose your identity in either direction, be that nothingness, extinguishment, or oneness. And there's nothing like that in Christianity. We remain ourselves. We are not only ourselves, but we are the best version of who we were created to be. That's actually a redundant statement there. We are who we were created to be, which is the best version of ourselves. And we will be that forever. So that is something that gives us far more meaning in life before the new heavens and the new earth, and also gives us an actual hope that is worth hoping in, rather than a sort of best case scenario that a lot of other worldviews can offer. But it's still nothing that's particularly exciting or particularly motivating, and it certainly does not make sense of us and make sense of what we are like now, and our sense of justice and all sorts of things like that. So that's the little introduction to what I'm going to be doing tonight. Does everyone have an outline? Good. I was wondering. I was thinking that someone maybe had come in here after playing golf in the rain. But, all right. Is someone willing to pray for us? Open us in prayer.
Sure.
Thank you.
Father God, thank you for a chance to concentrate and look at this issue, this reality of our souls, and to learn more about who you are through this study. Lord God, I pray that your presence and your spirit will be fully on Sarah tonight as she teaches us. And Lord, that our discussion would bring glory to you, and that we would be able to take this with us and be able to communicate it to others who need to see you. We thank you and praise you, Father. In your name, amen.
Amen. All right. Well, what I want to ask you first is, what is, in your estimation, the reason that we have emphasized the soul so much and have not only said, yes, the soul exists, but we've also tried to give you real philosophical arguments for why the soul exists?
I think because there's so much, you see all the time how much people want to not focus on the truth of God and put all of their eggs in the basket of science or other things without really truly understanding what they're really even talking about.
Right? Because if you put all your eggs in the basket of science, then it should actually, if you're honest, drive you toward asking the sorts of questions that someone in the religious or theological fields would ask. Because that's what we've shown. Science actually, if you're honest, if you're intellectually truthful, you will recognize that that is something that science, well, I'll say this. The soul is something that science cannot fully explain. And not only can it not fully explain the soul, but science also gives us reason to think there is actively something else going on. And then we have to realize that the question is not just scientific, it's theological, it's philosophical. So, and those are equally true. There is truth present in all of those areas. It's not just what can science tell us. But what else? Why emphasize so much that the soul exists? Because we spent the vast majority of the class defending that and not on death itself.
Well, it's awfully important if we know we're going to be lasting past death or not.
Yeah, right. It's the question that we're trying to deal with is what are we? And the only way that we can decide how to live and how we should live, and then what is next, if anything, is if we figure out what we are. So that is the foundational, preliminary, essential component to what we're doing now, today, which is focusing on death itself, and specifically how to live in light of death, seeing as none of us are actually dead. We're alive, so we need to figure out what to do in the meantime. So what I want to do, this outline is not very long, but I want to go through this, and if you have, as I go through it, I want you to feel free to bring in any insights that you have developed over the course of the class or any stories that fit, because often when we deal with that sort of thing, when we deal with real life, it helps us to process better and to remember and to kind of crystallize what we're talking about in this class. And we may not remember you may not remember what I said, but you'll remember a story that someone told. So feel free to jump in at any point. Okay. One of the things that we have to realize about death, because there are two ways of approaching this. There's approaching this through our own lenses and our own, how we personally look at our own death, and then also the reality that everyone else that we're going to be around is also concerned with death in some way, or should be. If they're not, there's something probably wrong. But everyone dies, so everyone is going to have a perspective on death, and most everyone is going to be concerned with death in some way. So we have to figure out how we should respond, and then that is going to allow us to help others think through it as well. We have to realize that humans, for the most part, are afraid of death. And this is partially driven by the confusion, the unknown of the afterlife, not knowing, A, if there is one at all, and B, what it's like, who's out there, what's next. So that was last week. And the best account of the afterlife, we are absolutely convinced, is the Christian account of the afterlife, which is that we do temporarily become disembodied until the ultimate end, the absolute end, which is going to be the establishment of the new heavens and the new earth, in which case there will be a general resurrection of the body. So that was last week. Are there any questions about that last week? Because I don't want to go on unless everyone feels fairly comfortable about what was covered. Since I wasn't here, I can't tell you exactly what was covered, but I know generally. Okay, so one of the benefits of knowing or of having an account of what the afterlife is like, and knowing the reliability of where we got that, which is the Bible, then we can help a lot of people. We can also recognize in our own life that we may not necessarily have to fear death. There are actually other things that might be worse, other conditions that might be worse. There are some people who are alive who are arguably living a life worse than death. So if we know what is next, then that puts things in perspective. That puts our current life in perspective. Another thing that we are afraid of, humans, is, I'm using we as the collective global we, that this is we as humans. Maybe not you personally, but most humans are driven to avoid pain and are afraid of pain. And it doesn't even really have to be pain, it can just be simple discomfort. Because an itch will drive you crazy, but technically an itch is not the same as a pain. It's something else. So discomfort is maybe a better word for that. And we're afraid of discomfort, and death seems to be the epitome of discomfort. And that's why people say, I hope I die in my sleep. I hope I go quickly, or something like that. Because it still seems horrible, but that somehow seems a little less horrible than some kind of prolonged drowning, prolonged burning to death, something like that. I recently saw someone post something on Facebook that said, it was a video of the deepest swimming pool in the world. I have no idea how deep it was, but it was so deep that you couldn't see the bottom. And people were diving down into this thing with no scuba equipment, and I started panicking just watching it, because I thought, humans are not meant to do that. And I felt like if I had gone just a little ways in, I would have drowned. And so I got this feeling of drowning, and it was terrifying and ridiculous because it was Facebook. But this gives you the idea that we do fear death. We are afraid of the pain that is associated with death. There are a lot of psychological and sociological accounts of why that is, but we also have to just realize that this is the case, and we have to develop an account of suffering and a way to deal with suffering. So, there are two basic responses to realizing that we're mortal, to realizing that, yes, not only do we suffer, but we die. We will at some point cease to be in this fashion. One of the ways to respond to that is that it can motivate us to get serious about meaning. So it can actually, what death, the realization of death can do for you is it can scare you into thinking that since you could depart this earth at any point, you need to make sure that your life, since it's the only life you have, the only, let's see, pre-redeemed state life that you have to make sure that you're being faithful with it. So, the other response is the opposite. It can cause us to take life lightly, too lightly. And this is what I call bucket list living. So let's say that you all of a sudden are diagnosed with stage 5 cancer, and you have gone through treatments and nothing's worked, and you are given a month to live. You could respond in two different ways. What's the idea of the bucket list?
Do everything that you always wanted to do.
That you always wanted to do, right?
No matter how crazy.
And this is something, when I taught the class of philosophy of death and dying at the Community College of Aurora, this is one of the questions that I asked, because I said, we assume that that's a good thing. We assume that nobody should be questioned for living life according to their bucket list. And we should all do it if we get to that point, where you just travel the world or you start checking off things that you've always wanted to do. But what if the purpose, your purpose for being here is not for your own edification? What if the reason that you are here and the reason that you have a month left even is not so that you can spend it doing whatever you've always wanted to do? Because if we think that there is more, that there is actually going to be a disembodied intermediary state, and then eventually we're going to be resurrected and are going to live for eternity in the way that we were created to live, in the most ultimately blissfully fulfilled state we can be in, then why in the world are you wasting that month on your stupid bucket list? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So your bucket list should instead be some kind of missional list. It should, maybe you do have fun, but you could still do it in a way that has a much deeper, greater perspective than simply checking off a list.
Or you could have a sanctified list
Yes!
and say, I need to reconcile with this person, or I need to donate to a cause that I always wanted to and I never did.
Right.
That's more what you're talking about, the meaning list.
Yes, exactly. So that has more to do with virtue than fun. Because if there is more to life than this, if this life is not literally all there is, and we have a good, a robust theological account. Oh, thank you. I have a really bad cold. Actually, I'm not contagious. It's just lingering. Thank you.
They're yours.
You sure you don't want them back?
No.
But if we're getting to the point where we are flirting with that common understanding of just enjoying life all the way to the end, perhaps we're missing the point. But don't hear me as saying you need to be miserable all the way to the end either. You don't have to necessarily say, oh, well, I need to then do some sort of medieval monastic end-of-life ritual where I just punish myself for all my wrongdoings and starve myself and flog myself and those sorts of things. That's obviously ridiculous, but what we are looking for is virtue, is what our character is supposed to be. And one of the things that realization of death does, this is one thing that J.I. Packer, who is one of my favorite authors, has written on recently. This is a book called Weakness is the Way. It's little and it is outstanding. It's a book that, I don't know how old he is. I want to say he's in his late 80s. He's not young. Excuse me. I've never actually blown my nose in class before.
All right, let's just give her a round.
Encore.
Weakness is the way. He wrote this book as what he considered to be his going out swan song, where he wanted to figure out what the most important thing was that he needed to communicate to those who he was leaving. And Packer, this is really Packer's legacy, what he wants to be his legacy. And he's someone who has struggled with debilitating issues his whole life. And now that he's old, he's a senior, he is more acutely aware of that. And so not only has he spent a large part of his life already suffering, but now he is suffering more and in a way that is much closer to death. And so that has caused him to ask, what is our purpose here and how do we get serious? Of course, while still having some fun. But what I mean by serious is not serious in tone or serious in personality. It's serious in mission, in your drive, in what motivates you, what gets you out of bed in the morning. And what Packer realized through doing, and he did a study in this book on Paul in 2 Corinthians, and he was saying that book, of all Paul's letters in the New Testament, the book of 2 Corinthians most dramatically shows Paul's feelings of weakness and recognition that he is imperfect. He is not even really respected by this Corinthian church. And he also Paul talks about having what he calls a thorn in the flesh, which we don't know what exactly that meant, but it does seem to be some physical malady that was not healing, and he didn't plan on it healing. So it was something that kind of haunted him throughout his ministry. And Packer realizes in this book, and he makes it very clear, that the point of this life is not us, because we are so weak. And the way that we can recognize what our mission needs to be in life, which is come to know the truth, come to know God personally, and then make him known so that we and as many as possible with us can be redeemed and can live forever in our ideal state. That is something that we can only accomplish through humility, through the humility that comes from realizing that we are weak, that we are broken, that we will die, and that God's purposes could be accomplished without us. And God doesn't really need us all that badly, which we hate to admit because we think we're very important. And yet he loves us individually, and he has called us to be witnesses to the truth and to have him shine, his truth shine through us in a way that others recognize what is true, but it's still clearly us. He's not trying to possess us and do away with our identity, do away with our personality. We're still our personality. We're still us in there. That dualistic self is still there. But when we are humble, then what we're doing is we are acknowledging that he is the point, that what Christ did on the cross to start the process of restoration is not about us, that we have to get out of the way. We have to get the ego, the narcissism out of the way for others to see Christ and to be attracted to him and not exclusively to us. So that's a hard concept. That's something that is easy to say, and it is very difficult to truly get it and to live that way. And I think that's why Packer wrote this book at the end of his life, because it's not something that he probably had staring him in the face until the last part of his life. And that's another thing that is, oddly enough, a strange benefit of death. Going back to the two ways we can respond, is that it can cause us to get serious and to say, well, I need to figure out what matters. And that's the bottom line. And you may feel like you've wasted time, you may feel like you have regrets, and you can evaluate those and just determine what you need to do in order to change, in order to help further God's kingdom, and despite the way that you may have lived up until that point.
I think a lot of times people make the mistake to think that they've done all this stuff and that they regret in their life, and that there's no point in changing, rather than to shift their perspective. I have the rest of my life, whatever that might be, whether it's 2 days or 20 years, why not change what you have left, and to give them permission to do so,
Yes.
or a reason to do so.
Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to change for change's sake. It doesn't mean you have to become a completely different person.
Right.
It just means become, and this is something that I hope you all remember, instead of being yourself, be the best version of yourself. That's the virtuous version of yourself. That's you in the sense that is actually able to help other people, able to point other people to the truth. So if you ever hear someone say, be yourself, you might want to respond with that and just see what happens. Poison the well against be yourself forever. Because if we're all ourselves, if you're just yourself, well, gosh, what version of me? Is it the part of me that is woken up at 6 in the morning because my neighbor's dogs won't start barking? That's not a good version of me. So I don't want to just embrace myself unqualified, because that would be very, very bad. Because I'm not, you do not want to be around me in that sort of situation.
Or me.
Yes. So Paul had that thorn in the flesh that is something that we need to acknowledge, because often what we think of is the people who God uses, the people who have God's favor, are somehow going to live good lives, or somehow going to live comfortable lives, or blessed lives. That's the prosperity gospel. That's that gospel that says, if you put your mind in the right place, your heart in the right place, say the right prayer, who knows what else, you will be blessed. Well, if you look at just about everyone who is used in Scripture, the people whose names are on certain books of the Bible, because they took up such a large, an important part of history, they rarely had good lives. Rarely. And it actually lends itself to this thesis that weakness is the way, that God uses people who are broken. He uses people who are humble because they are broken, and who have said, God, I can't make my life successful. I cannot find meaning in the small things because I seem to keep renewing this sense of sadness, depression. Maybe you have chronic pain. Could be any number of things. And at a certain point, you have to say, I need to figure out how God can use me through this, because I cannot make this better. I can't get over it. I can't make myself happy. I can't just think positive thoughts, because that's another thing that's interesting, is thinking positive thoughts doesn't work usually. It can work if you're thinking positive thoughts that are true, that are realistic. But if you are lying to yourself, you're going to call your own bluff at some point. And so positive thoughts can only take you so far. And at a certain point, we've got to be realistic and say, no, I need help that cannot come from this world. I need help that I can't create out of nothing. And not only do you need help, but you need the right kind of help, which does not mean healing necessarily. It doesn't, if you say, God, help me through a certain situation, He may not heal you. He may not make it better, but He also is, at least at that point, going to be more free to work through you, because you have just expressed humility. You've expressed a recognition of reality, that you are not going to be capable of creating ultimate meaning and working well, working for good, working for His kingdom on your own. All right. Questions so far, or comments? The idea of our mortality is something that we're all in various degrees aware of. If you ever are, I guess if you're an older person, you've probably said to younger people, enjoy your youth. Why is that? Why do you say that?
Because we didn't. I'd rather grow older than go back to my younger years, I tell you. I don't know if I'm really old enough to say that, but there's gray in here, it just doesn't show.
Okay, I have one. It's okay.
It's good.
Well, why else? Why do you say that?
Life passes by so quickly.
It does. It certainly does. But I wanted to charge you to say something a little different. Don't say enjoy your youth. Maybe replace that word with something a little more meaningful, such as maybe make the most of it. But that doesn't necessarily mean it'll be enjoyable. And the reason for that is because youth can be a curse. Youth can be something that puts you, at least in your mind, puts you at a distance from death. It makes you think you're immortal. It makes you functionally live as though you have all the time in the world. And you are probably aware of this, that not all the people who are young actually have all the time in the world. So enjoy your youth, I think, can actually be a pretty harmful thing to say. we have to qualify it a little bit. And I hope that people who are young do have enjoyment, but that's not the whole point. So,
Would it be more of a seize the day?
yeah, or even live each day like it's your last. What is the reason that we might say that?
Because it might be.
It actually might be, yeah. It's realistic. But why else? Because you're probably going to be wrong statistically. That it's not your last.
Having fun, leisure, just for no other reason than enjoying yourself and eating good food and being pampered is boring. After a while. I mean, it's really nice for a while. It's kind of like sin. It might be really nice the first couple of days, when you're sort of infatuated and insane, mentally incompetent to, but it's not fun. There's a fullness beyond self-gratification. And I don't know how you'd say that simply, because if you're saying this to a young person, you gotta say it in one fairly simple, non-compound sentence, right? Yeah.
No implied commas anywhere.
Basically 140 characters.
That's right. That's
2
right.
minutes or 2 seconds and you've lost them.
And sometimes that's too, but I mean, so how do you say that? I mean, enjoy your youth, have a full life, it's so vague if you don't have the gospel and the character reference to go with that. And that's probably why spiritual formation is so popular. It's character formation. It would be improved if it were character formation.
Right. It should just be Christianity.
Yes.
But that's another issue. Yeah, that's something that is enormously important that we need to realize. Well, let me ask you, would you rather, if someone offered you, hypothetically speaking, a life where you are well-fed, with the best food, you are constantly able to access the best drinks, you are comfortable, the temperature is always perfect, the air is always clean, the scenery is always nice, no one's ever speaking too loudly. So that's one option, that little world. That could be for the rest of your life. And then you were also offered another life or another version of a life where you may have some good food here and there, but you're not guaranteed it. But you are guaranteed influence and meaning and something a life that you can look back on and point out people who have benefited from you, and you can figure out where you have benefited from other people. So one is almost this isolated happiness. And the other is meaning. What would you pick? Because the meaning one is going to hurt sometimes too. It's not guaranteed to be comfortable. You're going to be in a room that's or you're going to be in freezing weather or searing hot weather sometimes. You're going to stub your toe.
Sarah?
Yes?
To that end, I talked to Gordon McDonald, I guess about a year ago, and he was discussing how he and his wife Gail worked at Ground Zero for several weeks after 9/11. And you think about that situation, it's as horrible as you can imagine. But he said that those few weeks were the most meaningful times they ever spent. There just a sense of holiness to everything they were doing. And people wanted to work so long that others would have to say, no, you have to go rest. Because they wanted to help, they wanted to be there. And we might say that is the most horrible thing you can ever imagine. And in one way it is. But if you're working on the right side, I imagine in that kind of situation you'd be almost completely emptied of self, because there'd be no room for it. And that's probably why it was so laden or thick with the presence of God, is that people were leaving themselves behind and putting themselves out as far as they could to properly tend for the dead and to save the living and to minister to those in trauma.
And one of the reasons I think that extreme trauma, really trauma on any level, it can be extreme trauma like 9/11, it can be moderate trauma like waiting for a scary test result at the doctor. But I think what trauma does, or what difficulty does to us, is it forces us to get realistic, and it forces us past the superficial small talk that maybe the caricature of this is kind of the 50s mentality of don't talk about politics and religion, everything is nice and happy, make sure that you're talking positive all the time. Well, why? Because if we have limited time, and well, let me stop myself for a second. Here's a story. Recently, my family in Dallas had Christmas together where we had family from out of town. This was this last Christmas. And my grandmother is older, and she's getting to the point where she's having questions, or she's asking questions that Packer is asking, but I think she's maybe handling them a little differently. And one of my aunts and her family is from San Francisco, and the vast majority of my family is from Dallas, Texas, which, if you can imagine the stereotype Dallas people and the stereotype San Francisco people, that is actually what collided at Christmas. And my grandmother's request was, do not talk about religion and politics. And then she uttered this other thing that was interesting after most people had left. She said, I am really concerned that, and she was talking about the San Francisco clan, that family has not made the right ultimate decision. And I thought, my gosh, why didn't you let us loose?
Yeah.
Because what in the world is the point then? Why are we together? Just to be family next to each other? Are you family just because you're around each other? Does that actually lead to meaning, or does that lead to just a fleeting sense of vague, warm fuzzies? So this is not something to mess around with. And that doesn't mean that I was going to be a jerk. I just really wanted to talk about this stuff. Because they are in a context right now where they are intentionally surrounded by like-minded people and are not hearing anything else that matters. So what they hear is, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. There's nothing else out there. That's what they're hearing. Why in the world would we have sheltered them from another perspective just because you don't want to be uncomfortable? Discomfort changes lives.
Come on, preach it.
I
told Sarah she's going to be in a pulpit someday. You have one right here, actually.
We'll just leave it alone. It might encourage me too much. So, does this make sense?
Yes.
This is something that is a major problem with American society, because we like to be comfortable. We like to keep other people comfortable. But at a certain point, the niceness has to yield meaning, or else it's pointless.
And
Yeah?
I was just going to say, when I was thinking of you telling the story too, or giving the example of a person that could pick just pleasure and comfort over meaning, I think a lot of that person I would pick the first one is a matter of misplaced values. I think it's somebody that looks at the world and says, this is what's truly valuable, this is what's really meaningful in life. And I think that's the person that Jesus, or that Jesus calls a fool in the parable where he talks about the person that stores up all the grain and says, take it easy, just relax, just enjoy the pleasure of life. It's this misjudgment of what's truly significant. And it's when that doesn't align with God's values.
That is exactly right. And so that's what we have to figure out is, first of all, yes, if we desire meaning inherently, if our leaning is toward the life that's a meaningful life but uncomfortable, maybe has parts that are uncomfortable, over the purely sterilized, fluffy life, then we'd have to the next question is, then what counts as meaningful? What sorts of things should we think? What sorts of things should we read? What sorts of character qualities should we pursue? And that's where we have to figure out whether or not the Bible is what we need to take seriously, because it does purport to be the answer to those questions. So that's where we do figure out what Jesus thought was important and what Jesus thought was not important. And if Jesus was who he said he was, then who's God, defeated death at the resurrection, it's pretty good credentials there, then what he thought was important is what we should think is important. And what he thought was not is what we should think is not. So that's exactly right. That the people who are fools, we don't have to go around calling them fools. That's not advisable. And we can be foolish. But foolishness comes from misplaced priorities, from what Augustine called disordered loves, where the things that we love are actually not that important in the grand scheme of things. They're small potatoes. So we have to make sure that we don't quit loving those things, but we rank them rightly. That we say ultimately, they're not as important as the large potatoes. Yes.
You said we could tell stories.
Yes, sir.
Deep stories. Well, around Valentine's Day of last year, my wife Rebecca went into senior behavioral health at the Lutheran Medical Center for depression. And she had electroconvulsive therapy for depression. She was there for 5 weeks. And I guess it was about halfway through, we found out she had a form of dementia. And I would visit her, it was 35 miles away from our house, visit her 4 to 6 times a week, and sometimes Sarah and I would go together, sometimes Sarah would go by herself. And I don't know how many of you have been in a psychiatric ward. Some of you have, maybe. I had not. And the first week or so, it was very difficult to adjust because they're locked up and they have very strict rules. And it was hard to see my wife under those conditions. But after a while, I would ask myself, how can I find meaning in this situation? It's not going to be enjoyable. I wish my wife were healed. I wish everyone in there were healed. But that's not going to happen right away. So can I go there and show love to those that Jesus called the least of these, my brethren? It's Matthew, the parable of the sheep and goats, Matthew 25, 31 through 46. And that's how I started to approach it, in light of what ultimately matters. Caring about people, loving people, make the most of a very distressing situation. And I found that that helped me get through that, because I was thinking, as I serve these people, I'm serving Jesus. This matters. And of course, my wife was first and foremost, but she wasn't that responsive sometimes. Sarah was that. And there were other people who were hurting terribly and were lonely. And I would try to literally touch them and comfort them and say something to encourage them, ask them questions. I would tell them I'll pray for them, and a few times I prayed with them. One of the women there actually had worked at Denver Seminary in the early 90s. She was deeply paranoid, so I tried to comfort her and encourage her. But what I was thinking a lot of the time was, these are the least of these. And Jesus says, how you treated the least of these is how you treated me. And that's something he'll ask us at the last day. Have we followed him, trusted him, and done his work in his strength?
And that's also, that statement of Christ is worth analyzing, because if he says, how you treat the least of these is how you've treated me, that implies that the least of these are not truly the least, because he surely is not. So that flips it on its head, saying that those who we may not be inclined to spend time around or spend time with are actually often those that we need to be more concerned for and more involved with. Because our loves, like Augustine said, are so often disordered. We so often would prefer to be around people who help us career-wise, or who maybe make us feel so good about ourselves because they keep saying how smart I am. Those people are fun to be around. What about the people who don't say that sort of thing, who are hurting so much that they can't get out of their own world, their own psyche? They're hurting so deeply that they are locked inside themselves and have no energy to offer you. They have no ability to actually listen to how smart you are, much less tell you how smart you are. So that's something to think about. And if we understand that everyone has a soul, like we do, and that everyone's soul is equally able to last forever in heaven, and then be regenerate once the resurrection happens, then that should change how we treat each individual person. Have you ever thought about this? This is something that did hit me in the psychiatric ward. If the new heavens and the new earth is going to bring a level of regeneration and restoration to us that means that we are who we were created to be, have you thought of those with mental illnesses? What they will be like? If there are people who maybe can't speak very well, or can't make sense when they're speaking, or maybe are paranoid, or people who for whatever reason have a mental illness that you can't quite stand, or you don't know how to handle it, or you don't really want to spend a whole lot of time around them because they're just running off your friends or something like that. Think about what that person might be like in the new heavens and the new earth, because whatever is underneath that disorder is who they were created to be. So that's something fascinating there. And I think that should move us to care about what society thinks is the least of these.
And you don't have to wait for that. I mean, God and Jesus love them. They're perfect, right?
Yes.
The way they are.
Exactly. That's exactly true. And another, since you said we don't have to wait for that, we also don't have to wait to see them, because often we block them out. And if you're around people with severe developmental disabilities, severe genetic disabilities, any kind of mental health issue, if you're around someone because you have to be, because they're in your family, or they have a breakdown and have to go to the hospital or something like that, then all of a sudden you start noticing people like that, and they are everywhere. They are all around. They're your grocery baggers. They're everywhere. So the opportunities for this are nearly endless, probably actually endless, because people keep being born. Yes.
Sometimes they have some really profound insights about God in those little glimmers that you can see who they really are. It's fascinating.
It is. That is very true. And they also have they can have direct wisdom too, because sometimes we can get so distracted by little things that we quit seeing the world as it really is and seeing things for understanding the sort of perspective that we need. Okay, one of the things that I want to go back to aging, because some of that will actually happen with aging, with dementia, and there are some other things. I think Parkinson's has some dementia features. Isn't it? You know if that's true?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so
And so does multiple sclerosis.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot of the physiological stuff, the lettuce rot, you know, does have that. And I think that's probably one of the most grievous losses, because the person looks the same, and there's no one home, or they're only slightly home, or they're behind a curtain. I mean, it's agonizing.
Right, and it's hard to know which of those it is. Right. So even though we're talking about the least of these, we will likely be that at some point. And we have to realize that this is not just, oh, we're the healthy ones who are totally there, we're fine, we're strong, we're self-sufficient. No, we will be that at any point, really. We never know. We don't know not only when we'll die, but we don't know when we'll decline. And sometimes it's very fast. So we need to get a grip on that. And one of the things that recognizing our mortality does is it causes us to reflect back on what we might consider wasted years or regrets, things like that. And if we're aiming for virtue, if we're aiming to end our life well and to continually try to sanctify ourselves, which means to grow in virtue, to grow in Christ-likeness as a believer, then what we have to realize is that wasted years may not be wasted if we learn from them, because they can actually, instead of being wasted years, they can be perspective-yielding years. They don't have to be, because some people just never learn from the past. But they are there for our edification. And sometimes the worst screw-ups are the greatest teachers. So that's something that we have to realize. And lost abilities are things that force us to realize, too, that we are not the sum of our talents. We're not the sum of our intellect, or the power of our intellect. We're not simply your career. You're not a teacher. I mean, you are a teacher, but you're not simply a teacher. Should have rephrased that. You're not simply a banker. You're not. So when people say, what do you do? That's all well and good, but the better question is, who are you? What makes you tick? What's your story? Something like that. Because what do you do can change.
Sarah,
Yes.
a friend of mine in Atlanta says, you know, they ought to just call the old folks Bible study we used to be. Because you talk to them and they say, well, I used to be.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. So let's start changing the language.
Right.
Who are you now? I hope it's better than what you used to be. And more focused, more driven, in the right way, driven for meaning. And maybe a mentor now, where you didn't give younger people the time of day before, which still is understandable. So, what we also will find is that close calls, even if you're not aging, I mean, obviously we're all aging, even if you're not facing death in a protracted sense, maybe nearly getting hit by a bus is a close call, or losing control while you're skiing, which is part of why I don't ski anymore, because I hit an ice patch and skidded about 20 yards down a mountain and nearly died of sheer panic. So, close calls, in varying degrees, can cause you to reassess your life and can cause you to bring things into focus and to reflect back on maybe whether or not you were a jerk 5 minutes ago for no reason, or what someone would have remembered you for had you died at that point. So these are things that can actually be helpful. Not ideal, don't go out there and flirt with buses, but there's still something that I think are very helpful to us ultimately in the character building sense. Yes?
That happened with Martin Luther. He was almost struck by lightning, I think, when he was in a carriage, and it had a profound effect on him. I don't remember the details of the story right now, but it's pretty well documented.
Yeah, and that happens to a lot of people, and it can be the thing that turns you around sometimes. That's why often, and it can be a close call that's not it's not a close call with an object or something like that. It can be a close call with depression or hitting rock bottom due to drug use. There it is. You're probably wondering if I'm on something.
Antihistamines.
Yeah, I wish.
Sarah, may I ask,
Yes?
we're running a little close to the end, and others may have different interests, and I'm open to that.
Mm-hmm.
But number E, the view of dualism in the afterlife will determine our end-of-life ethics.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can make time for that, I'd really appreciate not missing that section.
Yeah.
We don't have to do it right now, but
Mhm.
we got 20 minutes, so I
Oh,
thought
yeah.
I'd speak up, you know. Making the
Don't
most
you
of the
worry.
time now that I'm so old, you know.
That makes perfect sense. Well, let's just jump into it now, because this is something that is extremely important when we're dealing with questions like, when do you terminate life support? What do you do with people like the girl named Brittany Maynard, who had a brain tumor and decided to end her own life early. Physician-assisted suicide is the way she did it. And she moved to Oregon because that's legal there. And she ended her own life because she said she wanted to do it on her terms before it got too bad. Whether or not you believe in the soul and what you think of the afterlife is going to determine how you handle that sort of situation. And with Brittany Maynard, there was a response to her by someone who actually had the same sort of brain tumor. I think her name's Kara Tippett. I think that's her name. She's, if that is who I'm thinking, she's still alive, but she's not, she's close to death. But the response was something along the lines of, she was saying that she understands that Brittany Maynard did not want to suffer and did not want to go out of this world with seizures and lack of dignity and looking completely unattractive and feeling horrible, those sorts of things. But she said, this isn't about us. This is also about what meaning we can get out of this. And there may be meaning that we don't understand, that we don't see. So think about Brittany Maynard, who was married. Her husband was there with her when she killed herself. And what does that say to him? What was her ministry to him? Her unwitting ministry to him? What do you think that said to him? Any ideas?
This is all there is?
Yeah, this is all there is. Maybe she's not real concerned, she's not concerned enough with him to want to push through anything. That her pain was worse than, or the desire to end her pain was stronger than the desire to stay with him. Did you have something?
Yeah, I'm going to have to play devil's advocate just a little. There's also the aspect of you are so valuable, I mean, that you should not have to suffer while I suffer.
Mm-hmm.
And there's tears, but it's not all a selfish ball of self-gratification.
No, but you still have to ask the question, what is he taking out of that? That's the question that I'm interested in. Is not what she was justifying, how she was justifying it, but what did he actually take out of that? I don't know entirely, but I do know that it's not, there's nothing in there necessarily that would have taught him that there is more to life than avoiding suffering. Yes?
Along those lines, I had a discussion similar to this with someone who is a real advocate in the public health arena, talking about end-of-life decisions and costs.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, his attitude, you know, was essentially that old folks have a responsibility to, you know, go out on the ice floe. And,
Yeah, it's kind of like if the cat starts swirling the carpet, put him down, and that'd work for grandma too.
Right, which is the ice flow idea, if you haven't heard of it, is this, this idea that, and I don't know what tribe this was, it was some either Eskimo tribe or a tribe up around those parts that would supposedly put their elderly out on an ice floe and send them out to starve and freeze.
One-way trip.
the elderly would simply go on.
And they would do it willingly because it was considered to be an honor, and it was
responsible
the culmination of their life. So it wasn't even like they were doing it, they weren't literally picked up and put on the ice floe, they did it themselves. So, which willingness to kill yourself doesn't necessarily mean that killing yourself is okay, but that is what's called the utilitarian response, which says it operates under the assumption that your value is only your value to society. There's nothing intrinsically valuable to you or in you. So this is what's called extrinsic value, which means society puts value on you. Your culture puts value on you. So once you run out of perceived value, meaning once you stop feeding your family, once you stop being fun at parties, then it's time for you to go out on the ice floe. And bye-bye grandma at that point. So the question is, if we adhere to that, and if we say that, well, Brittany Maynard, when she started to go downhill, yeah, that's equivalent to just putting her out on the ice floe, to ending her life, saying she's no longer valuable to society. What has happened at that point to the least of these? For one, because if that's what if that's the outside evaluation, the outsider evaluation saying that now Brittany Maynard's time has come, then what does that open the door to? It opens the door to saying that whoever doesn't want to lobby for their own suicide, physician-assisted suicides, time could likely come, and it's the community who decides, because the community is the one who gives value. It's not, you weren't born with it, so it's possible that you never had it.
Yeah, Nazi Germany began exterminating useless eaters long before the genocide of the Jews began.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we did that too with the eugenics movement. America is not clean in that regard. Yes?
I was thinking another side, or another aspect of this issue too, is that we don't strictly belong to ourselves. That we all, since we belong to God,
Yes.
we don't necessarily have that right to say, okay, God, I'm gonna decide when Chad dies or when, or the humans happen.
Amen. I'm glad you went there. Because that's what the Christian should conclude. Is, for one, we do believe in intrinsic value, meaning you're born with value, whether or not anyone sees it. That's why we care about bullying, because your entire school could be bullying you, and the reason it's wrong is because the community's label or assessment of your value is considered to be wrong. That's one of the areas where our American society is a little bit confused, because we do tend to assume on the one hand that people have intrinsic value, and on the other hand we'll still have certain ethical discussions that seem to sound more like there is nothing special about individuals. It's all about how you benefit society. And once you've stopped benefiting society, then you're done.
Or once you cost too much.
Or once you cost too much, exactly. It's that cost-benefit analysis. So you can see, I think, how your understanding of the soul, your understanding of dualism and the afterlife is going to matter. Because, like you said, Chad, if there is an afterlife, and our goal here on this earth is to live in the way that is the appropriate response to Christ who saved us and who is calling us to meaning, to something greater than ourselves, then our discomfort, no matter what level of discomfort we find ourselves in, it does not give us license to end our lives. It doesn't give us the ability to say, I'm done, because we are not ours. We belong to the Creator. We belong to our Savior. We are not our own. So this is enormously important. Yes, go ahead.
I keep thinking about 18 years ago, my father passed away from cancer, and it was a pretty gruesome death. It was not pleasant. It was difficult for everyone in the family. But there were things that happened in his end of life for each of us in the family that wouldn't have happened if we cut his life short. You know, just our own experience of going through this with the Lord, and also just I had the privilege of being the only one with him when he actually departed, and to see the change in him right before his death is something I would have a hard time describing, but knowing that he was seeing his Savior by the complete and total change in his affect right before he died was the most amazing thing that has ever happened to me.
Wow.
And I just think it was beautiful for him to be released, but it was also an amazing thing for me to be there.
Oh, that's beautiful. And that's where this discomfort idea is not entirely bad. There is discomfort in the world that is entirely bad as far as we're concerned. We don't necessarily recognize the good in everything, and I really don't advise you trying to recognize the good in everything, or at very best, you're just annoying. At worst, you're probably deluding yourself. But
I think definitely, because it's not the bad thing that's good.
right.
It's that in sin and all of its manifestations, God is exquisitely able to bring something to us from
Amen.
even that. And that's
Amen.
amazing.
That is exactly it. And that's why we don't need to try desperately to avoid suffering all the time. Because he works in weakness and through weakness, and that is where he shines. So think about we're told that we're jars of clay, we're broken vessels. And that's how you see the contents of what's in there. Light can only shine through cracks. It cannot shine through a solid wall. Yeah.
You know, speaking of jars of clay, archaeology is my thing.
Ooh.
And so I have looked at life through the lens of archaeology, which is a lot of broken potsherds. And it's fascinating to me to see evidence of people and cultures that we have no understanding of. And I'll just throw out the example of Chaco Canyon, because a lot of people know what that is down in New Mexico. And, you know, it's obviously a big deal. You know, there are big buildings, there's all kinds of rock art, there's all kinds of stuff down there. Something was going on. It meant something to people. And I always think of the people in Chaco Canyon, you know, saying, well, what do you mean you don't know what Chaco Canyon is?
Yes.
It's the center of the universe. You know, how can you not know what it is? And it just kind of shows you that, at least it shows me, that every single thing that we do on this earth, from our buildings to our societies to our religions, they all just absolutely have no meaning at all, because they're forgotten, they fade away, they're just dust.
And the only thing that survives is what is ultimately true and important, that is of God. But what we have to remember, though, is that part of that culture, part of those buildings, part of that is because we were created to be creative, and we're created to be relational and live in community and those sorts of things. So it's not as though they're in and of themselves bad, but they are in and of themselves fleeting. And so on the one hand, they're good intrinsically because they're part of what humans are created to do and created to be. But on the other hand, they cannot save. They're not what is ultimate. They're not what is going to determine the course of humanity. So that is a very good observation. And Chaco, you should look up Chaco Canyon. It's really amazing, by the way, for those of you who are not familiar with it.
It's so fun to see how God steps into the cultures like that, though, when he is redeeming your little things that are fleeting and dust before him. It's a blast to see what he does once you're his.
Exactly.
I used to love video games, and I played them all the time, and I wasted time all the time playing video games. And then I became a Christian, and my priorities changed. But now I have a ton of friends, which you guys hear about constantly, who are gamers. And one of the ways that I connect with them is through video games, and who would have thunk it? I never, ever would have thunk it.
And your perspective is now right. And your loves are rightly ordered now. So you don't think of video games as the epitome of excellence, but you see it rightly. And that's why the little things, the little, art, movies, things like that, they're not bad necessarily. Some of them are horrible, but the idea of it is not bad. It's just that it's not saving. It's not ultimate. It is fleeting. So that's what I mean, going back to Augustine, by rightly ordering our loves, rightly having a right perspective on life. And that's the sort of thing that only pain and suffering and death can ultimately force us to deal with.
And maybe that's why, you know, Jesus told us ultimately we are to love. And that's love leaves no ruins and no potsherds and no billboards or anything like that, no monuments. It's love. It's simply love.
Yeah. But it's also the same Jesus who is loving, we still have to remember as the Jesus who cleared the temple and those sorts of things. So as long as when we talk about love, we also have to talk about it in reference to his other qualities of justice and righteousness and holiness, those sorts of things too. So you're right, but we have to make sure that we have a fully orbed understanding of what is meant by love. Because it doesn't just mean happiness, it doesn't just mean being pleasant, those sorts of things. Even though contemporary culture tends to think like that. But
That's the difference between happiness and joy.
Right.
Truly taking joy.
yes, yes. Okay, let's move into just a brief treatment of our hope. There are a lot of hopeless people in the world. And some of them lack hope of knowing God and knowing who they are, what they are, why they matter, where they're going. There are other people who lack hope of healing, hope of success, hope of relationships, those sorts of things. So we're dealing with two different sorts of hope. These are qualitatively different. The first one is a lack of saving hope. It's a lack of permanent hope, which is, like we've talked about, the hope of belonging to Christ, being one of his, and then awaiting restoration so that you can live out eternity with him. That is the only hope that lasts. That is the only hope worth having. Because there are a lot of people who lack small h hope, little local hopes, like hope of ever being able to be healed of a chronic disease, or hope of ever having an enormously meaningful job. Because a lot of people simply never land in a career that they think is their calling. And that's when we have to ask, well, maybe we need to deal with vocation and Christian life in a different way, because it may not have entirely everything to do with what sort of career you are in. But that's another issue. But there are people who have lost hope in their career. And we have to make sure when we're dealing with hope that we separate out those two things, because we shouldn't place our ultimate hope in good things. We've already talked about how the fact that expectation is not justified, because everyone that God uses in Scripture their life does not necessarily follow an ideal pattern. So that sort of hope there's really not much place for it in anyone's life. But that doesn't mean be miserable and be an Eeyore. It just means don't place hope there. Don't place ultimate hope there. You can have a nice, gentle, soft sort of hope where you say, I loosely hope I get this job. But you're not saying I'm placing my identity and my ultimate saving meaning and everything that is me on this job, and on whether or not I get this job, or whether or not I get healed from cancer, or whether or not I become a brilliant neuroscientist or something like that. Those are hopes that are fleeting, that will likely not happen, and even if they do happen, those occurrences cannot give you that level of hope, because they'll end, because we age, because we die. Because the people who hired us die and the new guy hates you.
Don't say that. Aging faculty members.
So, this is not something that's going to be a good match for that sort of hope. But what is worth hoping in is the God who is the creator. He is the sustainer of everything. He is the only saving action. He is the only saving person. He is the only one who knows why we were created in the first place and what we were meant to be and how to fulfill us. That's the sort of hope that we need to have. So I want you to read the new heavens and the new earth passages, Revelation chapter 21 and 22, when you get a chance. There's also a John Donne poem on the back. And it's a warning to death. He's personifying death. I'm not going to read it out loud because we're out of time, but I want you to read it. It is Old English, warning you. That's one of the reasons I actually think we need to teach Old English in schools, because it's part of being literate. But try to work your way through it if you can. And the very end is the very last line is why he's telling death to watch out, because death is not final. Death is not all there is. So, with that, that's the end of this class. So, thank you for this issue.
You're welcome.